Hey YouTube, I'm Ross Stewart with Stewart Media Digital, and I am here today to give you my long-term review on the Sony Zeiss 50mm 1.4 Planar lens. Now, if you follow my channel, you'll notice that I did a different type of review on this lens recently. I did a hands-on review using it to take low-light street portraits. But I want to really get into the nitty-gritty of this lens because it is one of my favorite lenses. It's one of the lenses I use the most, so I want to go over it really thoroughly and talk about everything that's great and everything that might not be great about this lens. So let's jump in. So first, a quick overview. 50mm, in my opinion, is one of the most important focal lengths to have in your kit. It's really versatile. You can step back and get some interesting landscapes. You can step in and get some great portraits. It's also really close to what our eyes see in terms of compression and distance. We have peripheral vision and we can move our eyes around, so our field of view is wider, but it's still really close to what our eyes can see. This lens in particular has a lot of great things about it. It has great bokeh, it is really sharp, it's great in low light, but it is pretty hefty. And it is also pretty expensive at about $1,400 US. So let's get into some of the specifics to find out if this lens is right for you. First, let's talk about build quality. In terms of build quality, it is very nicely made, but it is also very heavy and it's fairly large, especially compared to other Sony 50 and 55mm lenses. It weighs 27.5 ounces or 558 grams, and it is fairly large. It fits very nicely on Sony's full frame bodies, but you'll notice it is still quite a bit front heavy. Now, if you put it on an aps-c body like an a6000 or an a6500, it gets kind of ridiculous in terms of just how front heavy and how much bulk there is to the lens compared to the body. But if you get used to it, it's really not that big of a deal. It is an all metal construction, including the focus ring. The focus ring is not rubberized, which I actually really prefer. The focus ring has a good amount of resistance, which can be very nice if you're manually focusing or manually focusing in video. It is focused by wire though, so it's not going to be quite as precise as full-time manual focus. This lens has a manual aperture ring ranging from 1.4 to f16 with clicks at thirds of stops. It also has an additional click for auto if you want to control the aperture on your camera. I personally really like these manual aperture rings, especially with how small the Sony bodies are and just how many buttons and dials there are. It is nice to have a dedicated ring away from all of the buttons, but that's just my preference in the way I shoot. I know different people are gonna have different preferences, and that's totally fine. There's also a switch to de-click the aperture, which I understand can be useful for video shooters in certain situations. I have personally never used that. And then also on the other side, it has an autofocus manual focus switch, which some of the smaller 50mm lenses like the Sony 50mm 1.8 do not have, which means you would have to go into the camera menus and switch it to manual focus that way. So I really prefer having it right here on the lens. According to Sony, this lens is weather sealed, but it does not have a rubber gasket on the back, so I am hesitant to test that out myself, but I have used it in light rain before and I haven't had any issues. There's no water inside of the lens or any other kind of issues. Now let's talk about image quality. This is definitely one of Sony's sharpest lenses out so far. It is maybe the sharpest 50mm I've ever tested. It is insanely sharp. It has 12 elements in 9 groups with 2 spherical elements and 1 extra low dispersion element to reduce distortion and vignetting. It also has Zeiss's T-Star anti-reflective coating, which reduces flare and ghosting. So this lens performs really well in backlit situations and reduces a lot of chromatic aberration. Now, in terms of subject separation and bokeh, that's where this lens absolutely shines. I actually made an entire other video about it, using it for low light portraits at night. The bokeh is insane. The bokeh is super round and very dreamy and beautiful through most of the center, and it doesn't start to get cat eye until you really hit the edges. So it really performs like a very high-end lens, as you'd expect from a $1,400 Sony Zeiss team-up. It has 11 aperture blades for very circular bokeh, even as you start to stop down a little bit. One of the drawbacks of this lens for 50mm is that the minimum focusing distance is not that great, but it's not a macro lens and it's really not supposed to be. I've noticed I can get about as close as I need to for some tight portraits, but occasionally, especially compared to, say, Canon's Nifty 50 that has an amazing minimum focusing distance, I sometimes wish I could get a little bit closer with this 50. It has a minimum focusing distance of about 1.5 feet or 45 centimeters. Now, somewhere where this lens really shines is the autofocus. In both photo and video, this lens autofocuses amazingly. It tracks subjects very nicely with the Sony a7 III, a7R III, a7R4, a9, a9 II. The eye detect and face detect autofocus are amazing with this lens. It snaps right into focus and it tracks subjects very smoothly, very nicely. It works really well in backlit situations. It works really well in low light situations. I cannot say enough good things about the autofocus on this lens. Now let's compare it to some of its competitors. This one is definitely the most expensive one at this focal range, but there are other options. There is the Sony's version of the Nifty 50, which is about $200 US right now. It is a 50mm 1.8, but it performs really well. And if you're looking to get a 50mm, but you don't really want to spend a lot of money, this is a great option. I have an entire video comparing this, the Sony Zeiss 50mm 1.4 to the Sony 1.8, and it's a great look at a $1,400 lens versus a $200 lens, and hopefully that can help you decide if that price jump is worth it. There's also the Sigma Art 50mm 1.4. That's also 1.4, and that lens is also very sharp, but it is bigger and heavier, but it is also quite a bit cheaper at $950. But in my opinion, the Sony Zeiss is still the way to go because native lenses have better autofocus, they have fewer issues, and the size difference is definitely an advantage. In my opinion, the biggest competitor for this lens, or at least the one closest to hitting as hard, is the Sony Zeiss 55mm 1.8. It's about $1,000 US. So 1,000 versus 1,400, that's still $400 difference. But the 50mm 1.8 is very, very sharp. It still has a lot of those Sony Zeiss benefits like the anti-reflective coating, and it's very sharp. It has a 1.8 aperture, so you're not going to get quite as much bokeh as a 1.4. But it's also quite a bit smaller and quite a bit lighter, and can also pair very nicely with aps-c bodies, which the Sony Zeiss 1.4, it's pretty hefty on those aps-c bodies. So it might be more versatile in some cases. So when you compare the price, the size and weight, and the image quality, this is sort of a wash to me. I'm really not sure if I had both of these lenses, which one I would pick up for different shoots. So that's definitely something to consider. In conclusion, you may be able to tell already, I do really like this lens. I take it to almost every single shoot with me, and it spends a lot of time on my camera. It's very versatile for lots of different types of shoots, but it is expensive at $1,400. I'm a full-time working professional, so that $1,400, it made a lot of sense for me to go for the best bokeh, the best low light performance, the best sharpness. But there are a lot of other great options out there, and especially if you're just wanting to dip your foot into the 50mm focal range, I would also really recommend the Sony 50mm 1.8 at that $200 price point is really hard to beat. But if you're looking for the best, this is the lens to go for at the 50mm focal range. Anyway, thanks so much. Please be sure to like and subscribe. As always, see you next time.